Beat making isn't always about being fast, but it is important to capture an idea quickly to keep the momentum going. There are plenty of ways to do this, but if you use Studio One, then today I want to show you a little tool that can speed up your beat making and help you get more done. Hey there, I'm Ivan Calderon and welcome back to another video. So one of my biggest frustrations when it comes to making music and making beats is not being able to capture my idea quickly enough. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not always about speed, but my goal has always been to remove as many obstacles as possible from my music creation process to be able to get to the idea quicker. This is important if you're making music for yourself because you want to keep the momentum going, as I said before, but it's especially important whenever you're working with artists. If you are the producer in the room for an artist session, then your job is to create the vibes for them and to do it as quickly as you can. Luckily, we now live in the digital age where we have technology to help us be more efficient, and one of my favorite ways to leverage tech to make music is through the use of macros. I've done videos on macros before, but if you're unfamiliar, a macro is basically a shortcut that allows you to do multiple actions with one easy to use command. For example, let's say that you wanted to bounce a piece of MIDI to audio and then set the gain to -12 dB. Under any normal circumstances, that would be at least 2 actions that you would have to perform manually, but whenever you set that up as a macro, that entire sequence can be performed with the click of one single button. Macros can be as simple or as complicated as you want them to be, and they can be built and customized to suit any part of the music creation process, but I am particularly fond of creating them for beat makers who use MIDI. Over the past couple months, I've been building what I'm now calling the Beat Maker's Toolbar, which is essentially a macro toolbar built to simplify and speed up beat making in Studio One using MIDI. The toolbar will be linked down below in case you want to pick it up, but I thought for this video, we could do a deep dive into the toolbar and show you what it could do for you. Let's dive in. Okay, so jumping into the Studio One piano roll, if you look at the top here, this here is the Beat Maker's Toolbar. Now, this is essentially a combination of macros that were already present in Studio One, along with some other macros that I've modified, and even some that I've created from scratch myself, and all with the intention of making beat making faster and more efficient. I'm gonna go over and explain each of these macros in a minute, but to properly show what this toolbar can do for you, I think the best thing to do is to make a quick beat. Okay, so here I have a MIDI region created for impact, and I think I'm actually gonna start out with my drums. So the first thing I'm gonna do is set my tempo. I think I'm gonna make something like trappy. So 140 is a good tempo for that. And then the first thing I'm gonna do is create my snares. So I'm gonna go over to the create drums section here, hit create drums and claps on beat 3, and now we get this. Perfect. From there, I'm gonna go over to the next macro, create close hi-hats, and I think I'm gonna start out with 1/8 notes. And I want a little bit of variation on the velocity, so I'm gonna hit Command on my Mac. I think it's Control on PC. Hit that key that has the hi-hats, that'll highlight all of them. Then I'm gonna go over to select the upbeat, and then hit the velocity and hit 50. And now we get this. Okay. Now I actually think I want to switch the snare to a clap, so I'm gonna go ahead and do the same thing, Command, and then hit the key that has the snare and bring it up. Perfect. Next, let's go ahead and start to add those snares back, but I want them now as kind of like accents. So let's go ahead and actually go over to the drum editor here, which is just like the piano roll, but specifically for drums. Makes it a little bit easier to manually place them. So I'm gonna do okay, from here I'm gonna select these 2 snares, and then I'm gonna find the exact location of where they start. So on the 1.4, 1, 2, let's go over to this section here, 1, 2, and then I'm gonna hit the copy and paste macro, just to make it a little bit easier. Perfect. Next, let's add some open hats. So let's see, we could add them on the 4 maybe. Finally, let's add some kick drums. So let's do on the 1. On the 2 here. And then maybe like a double one. That needs to be a little closer. And then on the 2 here. Perfect. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go back to the piano roll, hit the zoom and loop macro. That'll basically zoom in into whatever I've played and activate the loop bar here. So it'll just keep looping. It'll make it easy for me to keep layering on this section. Perfect, and I think we have our drums created. From here, let's move on to the chords. So I'm gonna just pull up a piano. It doesn't really matter what you use, but for the sake of this demonstration, I'm gonna be using Nexus 3. Okay, the first thing I'm gonna do here is select a scale that I wanna work in. Let's do E flat minor. So D sharp, same thing, and then natural minor. Perfect. From here, I'm gonna go ahead and select that root note. Right there. Next, I'm gonna make sure it's selected, then go over to the Create Scales and Chords section and hit the Create Minor Scale. And that does this. Perfect, so now that I have the notes of the E flat minor scale, what I'm gonna do is go over to each of these notes and turn them into chords with another macro. So I'm gonna select the first, go over to the chord section, drop that down, go to the minor scale subsection, first chord. Select the second chord and do the same thing. Second chord, third chord, fourth chord, fifth, sixth, seventh, and then the last note is actually just an upper octave of the root, so we can just do the first again. Select and first, and now we have this. Perfect, so now that I have this in place, all I have to do is basically just rearrange these chords into something that makes sense for me, so let's go ahead and do that. So I know that I want to start out with the root, so, and then maybe, oh, I like that, let's get rid of all this. So it'll be 1, 3, 2, 4, I like that a lot. So let me go ahead and let's move this over. And to make this easier so you don't mess this up, you could also just lock in your scale. So let's see here. Ooh, yes. And then maybe another one here. So what we'll do for now, let's select this chord, go over to the 4 here, copy and paste. And then maybe like here, I don't know, we'll see what we can do. Dope. Let's go ahead and go over to the quantization, hit perfect chord / notes, and then I'll do this. And then go to velocity, hit it to 50, so it creates a nicer feel sound. And then let's go ahead and modify this last chord. So I'm gonna select it and then invert it, which is to say I'm changing the sequence or the order of these notes. So let's go ahead and maybe raise it. Hey. Okay, so the chords are done, but the one thing that I forgot to do, because this is trap after all, let's go back to the drums and I'm gonna create some rolls. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go over to this note here because I want it to roll right before that clap hits. I'm gonna change the value of my grid to 30-second notes and then hit split at grid. And then maybe some like triplets at the end. So what I'm gonna do is then select both of these, merge, change my grid to maybe like 8th note triplets, and then split at grid again. I think those rolls here are a little too early, so what I'm gonna do then is just select them, hit merge, and then I think I'm gonna do it here instead. So back to 30-second, and then split at grid. And there you have it. That is essentially the skeleton of a decent beat in less than, what, 5 minutes? This is what the toolbar can do for you. Okay, now that you've seen how it works and how easy it is to use, let's go ahead and break down these macros. Now, the toolbar is divided into multiple sections, including part, create drums, create scales and chords, select and edit notes, move notes, and time and velocity. Starting from the left, we have the part section, and here we only have one macro called zoom and loop. The purpose of this macro is to zoom into a piece, whether you've played it or programmed it, make a loop around that, and then activate the loop. This is really handy if you're layering and you want to keep that part playing over and over again. Next up, we have my favorite section, and that is the create drum section. Here we have 3 drop-down menus and 1 standalone macro, so let's go through it. The first drop-down menu here is called create snare/claps, and if you drop it down, you're gonna see 2 options: create a snare or clap on beat 2 and 4, or on beat 3. The placement of the snare will dictate a lot about the genre that you're creating, so if you're making something like boom bap or dance, then you want the snare on the 2 and 4, and if you're making something like maybe trap or R&B, then the snare/clap on the 3 would be a better fit. Next to that, we have another drop-down menu, and these macros here will allow you to create hi-hats either in quarter note, 8th note, or 16th note values, and all with the click of a button. Now, the cool thing about these 2 macros is that you can switch these up at any moment to create the pattern that you want. So for example, like I did in the beginning, I had a snare on the 3, and then hi-hats at 8th note values, and that sounds like this. But if I want to try the snare on the 2 and 4, all I have to do is go back under here, and then select that option. Let's say that I don't want 8th note hi-hats. Let's say that instead I want, I don't know, quarter notes. Maybe 16th notes. Maybe I want my snares to go back to the 3. The point is, you can switch these up as many times as you want until you get the right snare/clap and hi-hat pattern. Now, these took me probably the longest to create, but they are super, super handy and time saving. Now, the only thing that I'll say here is that for these 2 macros to work properly or at their best, you do have to be on a 16th note grid. If you're on any other value, they might not work their best, so just keep that in mind. Next up, we have the fill notes drop-down menu, and these macros are used whenever you want to fill notes in with different note values. Now, most of the time, you probably will be using the hi-hat macro instead, because that's one of the most popular uses of note repetition, but if you ever need to fill in a note of the same pitch quickly, then you can also do this here. The values available for this drop-down menu include quarter notes, 8th notes, 16th notes, and 32nd notes. The last macro in this section is called a note repeat, and this one here is for anyone who likes to play their hats or any other repetitive notes in by hand. So if you own an Atom, then you've probably noticed that there's a note repeat function on it. So from what I understand, the Atom is actually just externally triggering this built-in Studio One function. So what this ultimately means is that you can use it too, even if you don't have an Atom. To use it, go ahead and click on the button, and that'll activate the function. You'll notice that every sound you play will already be on a note repeat, but what you want is to isolate one sound and cycle through different values. So what you want to do is first trigger the sound that you want. So for me, that would be a hi-hat. And then on the pop-up menu here, go ahead and hit single mode. Once you do that, you'll see that your keyboard now has some pre-selected keys that will trigger different note repeat values based on the sound you selected. If the hi-hat and fill notes macros are for people who like to program their notes in, then this is for anyone who would rather play their notes in by hand. Either way, programming repetitive notes in Studio One has never been easier. Moving on, we have the create scales and chords section, and here we have 3 main macros with 1 drop-down menu. Now, the first 2 macros are titled create major scale and create minor scale. Now, the way these work, as you saw before, is that you first have to program and select your root note, and then hit either one of these 2 buttons to create the remaining notes of that scale. So for example, if I come in here and I program an A note and then select it and hit the create major scale macro, that will create an A major scale. Alternatively, if I select it and I hit the create minor scale macro, that'll create an A minor scale. Now, technically in Studio One, as long as you select the appropriate scale here on the piano roll and then lock it in, then you're good, because it'll only allow you to play notes in that scale. But the reason that I created these 2 macros, aside from having a quick way to detect the notes of a scale, is so that you can also use them with the following drop-down menu here labeled chords. If you drop the chords menu down, you'll see a few more subfolders. The first 2 folders are meant to be used in combination with the previous scale macros, because once you have your scale laid out, you can select each note, as you saw me do before, and then come into these subfolders and turn that note into a chord. So to show you how that entire process works again, I'm going to select that A note, hit the create minor scale macro, then select that first note again, chords, minor scale, first chord, and you can do that up until you fill this out. Now basically all this is doing is creating a triad chord or a 3-note chord with a bass note included. Now notice how I didn't label the chord names here, and that's because the names will vary depending on what scale you decide to create, but regardless, the chord formula is always the same, so this will work with any scale, major or minor. Now honestly, I debated whether or not to even include these macros here in the first place, because if you have something like Scalar 2, then that does this plus so much more, but I thought, what the heck, if anything, this could be a second tool for you to use, and if you don't have something like Scalar 2, then you can use this instead. Now, under the first two submenus, you have two more, and the first one here is dedicated to helping you create chords that aren't tied to a scale. So here we have the option to either create a major or minor 3-note triad chord, or a major or minor 7th note extended chord. So let's go back over here and select this B, for example, then go back over to that submenu, and let's create a minor 7th chord, and now we get this. Finally, the last submenu here is called Single Actions, and I plan to add more as time goes on, but for now we have one, and that is titled Create Bass Note. Basically, what this allows you to do is, let's say for example you had a chord, whether that be extended or triad, you can come in here and create a bass note for it by first selecting the root note, then going back over here and hitting that Create Bass Note macro. Finally, the last macro on this section, and another one of my favorites, and one that I totally forgot to showcase on the demo, is the strum macro. Now, the way this macro works is that it takes a 3-note chord and then staggers the notes based on the value of your grid to create a strum. Let me show you how it works with that beat we created earlier. So I'm gonna go ahead and I think I wanna make a really tight strum, so I'm gonna make the grid 164. And I'm gonna create the strum on these two chords here at the end. So I'm gonna select them and hit strum. From there, let me do a little bit of cleanup. So I'm gonna go to the end here and hit split at cursor, delete those, and then bring that loop back. And now we get this. Now, as I mentioned before, this macro is based on the value of your grid, so if you switch this up to something else, you will get a different vibe. So let me go ahead and showcase this for you. Strum notes, go over here, do a little bit of cleanup, split at cursor, delete, and bring this back, and now we get this. Now, at the moment, this only works with 3-note chords, but if there's enough interest, I can make another version that works with extended chords as well. Now, the next section is a select and edit notes section, and this one here contains simpler macros that are designed to help you better manipulate your MIDI. Now, the first drop-down menu here is a select menu, and here you have the option to select the lowest notes of a piece, the highest notes, the notes on the downbeat, the notes on the upbeat, every other note, and it even gives you the option to reverse a selection. Next, we have the length drop-down menu, and this basically allows you to convert any MIDI note to a value of your choosing, which include anything from whole notes all the way down to 64th notes. Next, we have the split drop-down menu, and here we have two options, split at grid, and then split at cursor. The split at grid is great for creating smaller notes based on the value of your grid, and a good example of this, like you saw in the demo, is to create hi-hat rolls. On the other hand, the split at cursor macro is better if you want to have more control of where the notes split. So if I want to split this into two, I can just go here, split, and then split at cursor. Next to that, we have the merge macro, and this one basically just merges notes together. So let's go ahead and put this chord back to where it was by hitting the merge button, and there you go. Now, as you saw before, I used this macro a lot with the split macro to create those different hi-hat rolls based on my grid's value. Finally, the last macro in this section is the copy and paste macro, and this one basically allows you to copy any MIDI note, whether that be a single note or a chord, over to wherever you have your cursor. So let me just showcase that one more time. If I wanna maybe copy this entire chord over here, select it, go over here, copy and paste. Moving on, the next section is called Move Notes, and here we have 4 main macros that allow you to move your notes in particular ways. The first 2 macros here allow you to move your notes or chords between octaves. So let's say, for example, that I want this chord to be a little higher. I can just hit the up octave or back down. And the last 2 macros here allow you to invert your chord. That is to say that it changes the order of the chord notes to give your chord different voicings and make your compositions a little bit more interesting. So for example, I can take this first chord here and invert it down, or I can invert it up. And again, this just gives you a lot more options to have different and more interesting compositions. Last but not least, we have the time and velocity section. And here, we just have two drop-down menus. The first is called quantization, and here the first macro that I have is one that I've labeled perfect chord / notes. This button will basically take any notes or chords that you have played or programmed, quantizes them to a 16th note grid, extends the end to the start of the next note or chord, and also quantizes the end. So to showcase this again, here I have the chords of the beat we made earlier, but now the lengths are different and the quantization are different for each of these as well. So now, with the click of a button, we get this. Now below this, we have another drop-down menu called Quantize Note Lengths, and this allows you to set the length of a note to either 8th note, 16th note, or 32nd note, while at the same time also quantizing them to a 16th note grid. Now I tend to use these a lot with drums whenever I play them by hand, because this way I can set individual parts like the snare and the kick to specific lengths and to a preferred quantization value. Now at the very bottom here, we have one last macro titled Humanize Time, and this one basically gives your notes a more human feel by offsetting the quantization a little. Let me show you here by selecting this chord, which is perfectly quantized, and then clicking that Humanize button, and as you can see, things are not as perfect anymore, which is something that you might want for your compositions. Finally, the very last drop-down menu here is the velocity menu, and much like the name implies, you can use this to give your notes different velocity values based on 25% increments. So if I take this chord here, I can set it to either a 25% velocity, 50%, 75%, or even 100%. So there you have it, that is the Beatmaker's toolbar. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, if you wanna grab a copy, you can do so at my website, so I'll make sure to link that down below. I really think it'll help with your production. Now, one huge disclaimer that I wanna point out here, because I'm not a fan of shady business, is that if you do decide to pick this up, yes, you're paying for the custom macros that I created from scratch, including the drum macros, the chord and scale macros, the strum macro, and even the quantization macros, but what you're really paying for is convenience. Studio One comes with a bunch of default macros and commands already in place. So as I mentioned in the beginning, what I've done is I've curated some of the best macros for beat making, modified others to fit the way that I like to work, and even created some from scratch myself. Now, if you're savvy enough with macros in Studio One, then yes, you could potentially come in here and then recreate all of this yourself. But if you're someone who doesn't want to deal with any of that and you just want something that works, then this is for you. If you do decide to pick it up, then what I will say is that this supports me directly and allows me to continue making these videos for you, so thank you so much. Finally, if you do decide to pick this up, you get VIP email support and free lifetime updates forever. So if you have any trouble setting this up or whatever the case might be, just email me and we'll figure it out. And as more commands start to come out for Studio One, I'll be updating this toolbar to make it better, and you get those updates for free. Forever. But that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching. The toolbar will be linked down below in case you want to pick it up. But as always, like this video if you'd like to subscribe if you're not already. But I'll see you on the next one.